at the sea. Not the sea as we know it today, charted, measured, crossed 1,000 times. Look at the sea as it appeared to the people who made these maps. It is vast, it is unknown, and it is full of monsters. For centuries, European mapmakers populated the edges of their world with creatures that would terrify even the bravest sailor. Creatures that coiled around ships, swallowed men whole, and rose from the deep like living storms. They had names: the Kraken, the Leviathan, the sea serpent, the Zephyrs, and they had faces. You could look them in the eye right there on the page. But here is the question that makes this map so fascinating. Why? Why did serious, learned, professional map makers, men whose entire purpose was accuracy and knowledge, fill the oceans with things that did not exist? The answer, it turns out, says everything about what maps really are. Not just records of the world as it is, but portraits of the world as people imagine it, fear it, and understood it to be. This is the story of the sea monster on the map, how it was born, how it flourished, how it was sold, and how quietly it disappeared. To understand the sea monster on the map, you have to go back further than the age of exploration. You have to go back to the beginning, to the Greeks, and to their vision of how the world was shaped. For the ancient Greeks, the world was a disk of land encircled by a great river of ocean called Oceanus. It was not just a body of water. It was a boundary, the edge of the world. Beyond it lay something other, something beyond human reach and human understanding. This idea never really went away. It transformed, reshaped itself, and re-emerged in the great medieval maps known as Mappamundi, maps of the world as Christian Europe understood it. Here, the ocean ring was not just geographical, it was theological. The sea was where God's authority faded into mystery. It was the outer dark. The creatures that lived there were not random inventions. They came from respected ancient and medieval sources. Pliny's natural history was one of the great encyclopedias of the ancient world. For medieval readers, Pliny was an authority. If Pliny described a strange beast, a giant fish, or a people with impossible bodies, those stories carried weight. Saint Augustine gave these wonders a different kind of authority. In works such as The City of God, he discussed strange peoples and monstrous beings not simply as curiosities, but as part of a Christian universe created by God. Even the bizarre and frightening could have meaning. They could be signs of divine order, reminders that creation was larger and stranger than human understanding. Medieval bestiaries carried this tradition further. These books described animals both real and legendary and gave them symbolic meanings. A beast was never just a beast. It could represent sin, virtue, danger, temptation, or divine mystery. When medieval map makers filled the ocean with monsters, they were not merely decorating empty space. They were drawing from a world of inherent knowledge, where ancient authority, Christian theology, and wonder all mixed together. The medieval scholar did not sharply separate the natural from the supernatural. If a credible ancient author had written about a whale that capsized ships, that whale could go on the map. The ocean, in this worldview, was not empty. It was full of God's creation in its most extreme and overwhelming forms. The sea monster was not a lie. It was a statement about the nature of the deep, dangerous, divine, and beyond human mastery. century, and everything was about to change. By the end of the 14th century, Portuguese sailors were beginning to push beyond the edges of the European maps. Their ships were fragile, the winds uncertain, and the waters ahead many still believed them to be dangerous and forbidden by God. But they sailed anyway. Slowly, they began to trace the coast of Africa. Each voyage carried them farther into the unknown, and each return brought back something more valuable than any cargo: knowledge. The fear of the open ocean didn't vanish all at once. It was broken apart, piece by piece, cape by cape, line by line, drawn into a map. As the coastlines became known, European maps began to stretch. The world that had once seemed fixed started to expand. First along the African shore, then across the Atlantic, and soon Portugal and Spain were locked in a race, each kingdom scrambling to claim more of the globe before the other could. Cartography became a matter of power. Maps were guarded like state secrets, and the navigators who knew how to guide the ship across the open ocean, who could read the stars, feel the currents, those navigators became more powerful than kings. In that age, knowledge was the most dangerous thing a man could carry. What a navigator held in his head was worth more than gold, worth more than armies. The known world had cracked open like an egg, and the maps had to grow large enough to contain it. You might expect this to be the end of the sea monster. After all, the more the world was explored, the less room there was for imagination. But the opposite happened. This was not the end of the sea monster. It was its golden age. And nowhere is this more remarkable than in one map, created in 1539 by a Swedish archbishop named Olaus Magnus. He called it the Carta Marina, the sea chart. It took him 12 years to complete, and it remains as one of the greatest pieces of cartography ever produced. Look at what swims in these waters. There are creatures with the heads of pigs and the bodies of fish. There are serpents long enough to coil around the ship's mast and drag the crew into the sea. There is a thing that resembles a giant lobster the size of an eye. There are whales so enormous that sailors, according to the old legend of Saint Braden, once mistook one for an island, lit fires on its back, and only fled when the creature began, very slowly, to move. This one is called the Ziphius. It has the beak of a swordfish and the body of an owl, and in Olaus Magnus' telling, it is in the habit of splitting ships in two with a single blow. It sounds fantastical, but is described in precise, careful detail. Because Olaus Magnus was not a fool or a fantasist, he was a learned man, deeply serious about his work, and he also had sources. He had classical texts, he had travel accounts, he had decades of reports from Scandinavian fishermen and sailors who had genuinely seen things in the ocean that they could not explain. And here is where it gets really interesting, because many of those reports, however distorted, had a kernel of reality. A roaring, basking shark washed up on a beach with its jaw and gill arches dissolved away looks disturbingly like a long-necked sea serpent. A giant squid, a creature that can reach 15 meters in length, can in fact drag a man underwater. The oarfish, which can grow to 11 meters and tends to rise to the surface when he is dying, will be enough to terrify any sailor who had never encountered one before. The sea monster was born from a collision, ancient authority on one side, genuine sailor terror on the other, and the human need to give shape to what is unknown. The result was not a lie. It was an act of imagination filling the space where knowledge had not yet arrived. And Olaus Magnus had given that imagination its greatest canvas, but it was not the last. 30 years after Olaus Magnus completed the Carta Marina, a a Flemish mapmaker in the city of Antwerp was doing something that would change cartography forever. His name was Abraham Ortelius, and in 1570 he published a book. He called it the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the theater of the world. It was the first true modern atlas, a systematic collection of maps, uniform in format, bound together in a single volume. Nothing quite like it had existed before. It went through more than 40 editions. It was read by nobles, by scholars, by kings. Abraham Ortelius had not just made a map, he had made a product. And his maps had monsters. Look at this one, his map of Iceland. The sea around the island is alive with creatures. There are serpents, there are enormous fish. There is something here that looks very much like the Afgufa, a creature from Norse legend so vast that it was sometimes mistaken for a chain of islands. Many of these creatures are borrowed directly from Olaus Magnus, whose Carta Marina Ortelius knew well and admired. But look at the difference. The monsters on the Carta Marina are wild, crowded, urgent, pressed into every corner of the ocean, as if Magnus could not contain them all. The monsters on Ortelius' maps are something else. They are refined, beautifully engraved, carefully placed. They are, in a word, decorative. And that word is not a dismissal, it is a clue. Ortelius was a businessman as much as a scholar. He understood that his atlas was a luxury object, something wealthy buyers will display, discuss, and return to. The sea monsters were not just inherited tradition. They were part of the appeal. They made the maps beautiful. They made the ocean exciting. They gave a buyer something to point at and wonder about. In this sense, Ortelius represents something genuinely new in the history of the sea monster. The monster as a spectacle, a visual pleasure, as the thing that makes you want to own the map. And yet, there is a tension at the heart of Ortelius' work that makes him one of the most interesting figures in this story, because he was also genuinely trying to be scientific. He was meticulous about his sources. He published a catalog listing every cartographic authority he had drawn upon, an act of rigor that was remarkable for his time. He corresponded with the great Flemish mapmaker, Gerardus Mercator, who was busy developing the mathematical projections that would define cartography for centuries. Ortelius was not a man who believed everything he drew. So why did the monster stay? Because Ortelius understood something subtle. The map is never completely a scientific document. It is also a cultural one. It carries the expectations of its readers. It speaks the visual language of its time. And in 1570, the visual language of the ocean still included monsters. Not because people were ignorant, but because the monsters were doing real work. They were marking the edges of the known. They were marking the unfamiliar legible. They were telling a story about the world that pure measurement could not yet replace. Ortelius would publish editions of the Theatrum for the rest of his life. He died in 1598, and those later editions are telling. The monsters thin out, they retreat. The ocean becomes slightly more empty with each decade. Ortelius himself, it seems, was watching the world change around him, and quietly, map by map, letting the creatures go. But before we watch them disappear completely, it is worth pausing to ask the question directly. What were these monsters actually doing on the maps? Because they were never just about fear of the deep. They were working, doing several jobs at once, often at the same time. Consider what a map is politically. It is a claim. It says, this is our world and this is what we know. And this is where our authority reaches. A sea monster placed in a particular stretch of the ocean could send a clear signal. Here, our knowledge ends. Here, our power does not reach. It was a marker of the edge of empires as much as a creature of the deep. Some historians have argued that monsters were placed intentionally in seas claimed by rival powers, a way of casting doubt on the safety of the seas. At the same time, some monsters were placed exactly where the sea itself was most dangerous, where strong currents run, where reefs lurk near the surface, where ships have been lost. A monster was sometimes less a mythological statement and more a practical one. Do not sail here without a pilot who knows these waters. Monsters were not accurate, and they were not scientific, but they were not useless either. And underneath all of this ran the deepest current of all, the theological. The ocean had always been, in Christian thought, the domain of God's most terrible and sublime creation. The book of Job speaks of the Leviathan, a creature so vast and powerful that only God can master it. To depict the sea as full of monsters was, in part, an act of reverence. It was a way of saying, here is a world that belongs not to us but to something greater. The monster was a reminder of human limits, drawn in ink, placed at the edge of the world. The monster on the map was political, it was practical, it was theological, it was commercial, it was beautiful, it was everything except simple. Then, gradually, something began to change. By the 17th century, the sea monster was in retreat. The scientific revolution was underway. The Royal Society in London was insisting that knowledge be based on observation and experimentation, not ancient authority, not inherited legend, not the reports of frightened sailors. Cartography thus becoming a science of measurement, triangulation, astronomical observation. The map was becoming a different kind of object, not a portrait of the world as imagined, but a record of the world as measured. And on this new kind of map there was no room for monsters. They did not disappear at once. For a generation or two they lingered in the decorative borders, sea creatures swimming in the elaborate pictograms that framed the title, in the allegorical figures representing the continents, in the ornamental waves that filled empty water. They became ornament. They were moved from the body of the map to its margins, and then, quietly, from the margins to nowhere. By the 18th century, the professional cartographer no longer placed monsters in the sea. The ocean on the map was empty, accurate, correct. There is a famous expression associated with old maps, "Here be dragons." It appears in its Latin form, in one of the only known early cartographic objects to show the phrase. A small globe from around 1510, where the words "Hic sunt dracones" are written in the Eastern Ocean, near the coast of Asia. One map, one phrase, and yet it has come to stand for an entire era of cartographic imagination, for all the things that people believed or feared or wondered about before the instruments arrived to measure the world and silence the monster. The ocean did not become less mysterious when it lost its monsters, it became more so. We have mapped the surface of the moon in higher resolution than we have mapped the floor of our own ocean. Vast stretches of the deep sea, the abyssal plains, the adult ranges, the mid-ocean reaches remain uncharted, unexplored, unknown. The creatures that live in the deepest water are still being discovered. New species appear every year. Things that, in their strangeness, will not look out of place on Olaus Magnus Carta Marina or in the margins of an Ortelius atlas. The monsters on the old maps were born from a very human instinct, the need to put something, anything, in the spaces where knowledge had not yet reached, to make the unknown visible, to give shape to the dark. We no longer draw sea serpents in the empty ocean, but the empty ocean is still there. The deep is still deep. Whatever is living in it has no name yet, waiting, somewhere below the reach of our instruments, for the right cartographer to come along.